Today, we have a crazy revenge story about OP's parents stealing their inheritance. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, how I got back at a deceptive boss. It's so crazy how a firm as large as the one I once worked for paid each of their staff over $300,000 annually, but fixing the guardhouse was such a big deal to them. I never expected such a minor issue to escalate, but they just kept stepping on our toes without expecting us to fight back. It was never my dream to be a guard for a firm, no matter how large they may be. When I first moved to the country, I had hoped to serve the country. The goal for me was to join the military, but I was always too scared to enlist. A friend suggested I work for an agency. He said, and I quote, "If you got the balls to work as a guard, then you can be a soldier." Funny how now that I think about it, they're not in any way similar, but it got me to where I am now, so I'm not complaining. I joined the agency and they taught us some basics, like how to load a gun or defend ourselves, but it wasn't half of what we endured or learned in the military. As soon as I got recruited, it felt like a dream come true. I was bold enough to go for it. I quit my job as a guard since there was nothing major going on at the place I worked. I just went and did my thing. I never encountered any situation that required me to use force or weapon, but I felt ready, yet nothing prepared me for the reality. I thought I was strong enough to handle being on the field and serving the country I worked so hard to get to, but watching men turn brothers die before my eyes was so traumatic for me I had to leave. I saw things that made me lay awake, unable to sleep at night, so I figured I'd get my old job back, only this time I upgraded myself. I joined the agency back and underwent the basic training procedure, and while the job may be boring, it paid the bills. I worked as a guard for a law firm. The firm prides itself in being so careful with their staffs. Different files of clients' cases stored away at the office and the building, so they make sure there were people guarding the place each day. I worked better at night, so I was always on the night shift with a couple of other guys I met at the agency. There wasn't much to it. We made sure the building was secured, kept watch on the staffs that came in during our shifts, or the cleaning crew, and took rounds taking a tour of the building just to make sure nothing was out of place or there was no intruder in the building. I do not know what most people think being a guard is about, but we certainly take breaks, and this is where the issue lies. The company had a strict policy against having anyone who wasn't working entering into their building, including the guards. Our job was to secure the place, and only when necessary patrol the building before leaving, and it was fine, but then the little space we had to stay was the worst. The firm had a small building reserved for us to sit or change our clothes, and I must say, the building was nothing to talk about. It had a leaky roof and its windows were broken. There was no heater, but somehow the door still managed to hold itself together. That came as a surprise to us. It was unfit for a person to stay, and we've made complaints to the agency, who said they were going to take it up with the higher-ups at the firm, yet there was no response from anyone. The guys and I tried on many occasions to meet with the head of the firm, but he always rejected our audience. On our third attempt, he told us to take any requests we had to our boss. The agency was responsible for our pay and any issues we had. We had no reason to meet anyone at the company in the first place, but it was getting out of control, especially with the change in weather. The cold was too much. We had to wear extra jackets for warmth, and even then, it did so little for us. And on the rainy days, we couldn't afford to stay inside the guard room, so we always stayed at the waiting hall for warmth, and this always caused a lot of quarreling between us and the workers who think we should be out doing our jobs instead of staying inside the office we were not authorized to enter. No matter how much we explain the state of our guard room, they do not want to hear it. No one wants to hear the excuse of a guard. To them, we're machines who have been assigned to a particular station, and our job is to stay at our side without complaining. I decided to take matters into my own hands and went to meet the boss I worked for. He told me it was going to be sorted. He apologized for his lack of awareness and said he should have called the attention of the firm to our case, but he was going to send a report to the company and get them to fix our building for us. It felt like we were finally getting heard. I was hopeful that the proper things would be done, but when we got called to the HR's office, who told us with a straight face nothing was going to be done about the building, she said the last people that worked at night did so without complaining, and they knew that job, so we needed to man up and take our job seriously, otherwise we would be out of jobs. It felt as insulting as it sounded, and like they said, if they were going to do nothing about the guardhouse, then I guess the waiting room was my new office. I made sure to slack off more than usual because this irked the worker even more. Seeing someone who was supposed to be responsible for their office safety seated on a chair in the waiting hall instead of securing the building didn't look good, but I didn't care. My partner was a bit more reserved than I was. He still did his job effectively, but I, on the other hand, I was being rebellious. Whenever staffs accuse me of being unserious with my job, I tell them to F off, and if they wanted to take it further, I tell them to tell their boss to have our station fixed. Otherwise, we were sharing the office space. I'm pretty sure a couple of complaints were made to the agency about me, but I couldn't care less because I was beyond mad. I knew how much they paid their staffs. They were just being mean to us because they saw us as underlings they could treat anyhow. I knew security guards weren't seen as the most respected people in the job sector, but this was out of line. I decided to speak with my boss about the response we were given and how he needed to speak up for his workers. He didn't look mad or surprised when I told him. I'm guessing he knew already, but then his response provoked me even more. He said I had come to terms with the fact that the company wasn't going to make these changes because they pay us more than enough, and if they were going to renovate the guard station, they would have to cut our salaries by half. This was a load of crap, and we all knew it, but I knew something wasn't adding up because we should be able to speak up. I asked my boss what we should do, and he said nothing. I asked why, and he showed me the contract form between the firm and the agency, and it was stated on the file that damages incurred before, while and during our working tenure was going to be amended by us, and my boss gullibly signed the contract without thoroughly going through them. They were lawyers. They knew how to back a person into a corner, and they did just that with my boss. So our options were limited. Either we made the changes ourselves, or they reduced our salaries by half if they renovated the building. I wasn't going to back down, and I wanted to see to it that not only do they get to renovate the building, but we also got compensated for it. Honestly, so I hired a lawyer who didn't work for the firm. She was a friend and she was good. One look at the contract and she could tell it wasn't going to be an easy fight. The only way I could afford to win was if I had anything to contradict the contract or if the firm had also broken the contract agreement. I tried to think back to anything I could have seen that could implicate the firm, but there was nothing. They actually treated their staffs well. I doubt anyone would want to testify against them, but then I remembered the cleaning staffs. I decided to speak to them about the firm and how they were treated, and they had a lot to say. They saw those who weren't their fellow lawyers as underlings and took advantage of them. We decided to sue them, and we knew it was 30-70 chance because the firm had more chance of winning, but I was willing to take it. My boss wasn't as dedicated as I was, but I saw we had a fighting chance with the testimony of each cleanup staffs we could win the case. That did not go as planned. The firm was smart and were not new to threats. They paid off the cleanup crew just to prove that they were ahead of us, so our case was a massive failure in court. One look at our case, and the court ruled the firm not guilty because, like they said, we signed the deal on our own accord, and even when we pleaded with the judge to have someone take a look at the state of the inhumane place we stayed at, and he said it wouldn't make any difference since it was signed off by our boss. Not only did we lose the case, but we also got fired from the firm. The problem wasn't being fired. The agency could always find somewhere better for us to work, but I wanted to pay them back. I wasn't the brightest when it came to books, but I remembered during one of my wait in the halls, some of the newbie staffs that arrived early were talking about how their boss had been preparing aggressively for a case he was going to be handling, and how it was the case of a major client. I decided to investigate a little further, and it turned out the court date was still a week away at 10 in the morning. This gave me enough time to set my plan. I had the boss followed for 3 days, and I notice he never misses his morning coffee. If he wasn't the one getting it, then it was his receptionist. On the day of the case, I made sure to disguise myself well so I wouldn't get caught, and bumped into him on his way out of the coffee shop. This caused his coffee to fall, and he made a scene about how he had a big case today and how I had almost ruined his suit. I had to apologize for a while before going to get him a new coffee, like I wanted, and I might have spiked his coffee a bit with a sleeping drug. I knew this wasn't going to endanger his life in any way, since he had a driver, but I just wanted him to look incompetent as he made us feel. He got to court and he was a mess. He kept dozing off while the opposing party was making her claims, and the client wasn't impressed. Because of his attitude, the client lost the case and he lost the client. I'm sure he had no idea I was responsible for anything, but I got to see him lose something too, even if it was just a client. Also, hi, my name is Brendan, and if you guys enjoy these nuclear revenge videos, it would be awesome if you left a like or left a review if you're listening to our podcast. That said, our next story is, I won the lottery in life, but not with my vulture of an ex-wife who took everything from me when I lost my job. My unfaithful ex-wife got a divorce and took everything from me after I lost my job, and I made sure she couldn't get her hands on anything I owned after our eventual divorce, which just so happened to be right after I had just won the lottery. I, male 36, and my now ex-wife, female 32, have been married for the better part of the last 6 years. Prior to meeting her, I had only ever been in one serious relationship, which lasted for more than 10 years. We were childhood lovers, and we had known each other since we were both teenagers. Things ended between the both of us back then because of only one thing. She fell out of love for me, and I was really looking to move things to the next level at the time. Her reason at the time was that she had been waiting for when I would pop the question, and seeing as I was taking my sweet time, she wasn't having it, and she also felt like I was wasting the most valuable time of her life when she could be out there living her life to the fullest. I didn't want it to seem like I was holding her back when I didn't know myself whether or not I wanted to actually get married to her, and so I did what I thought was the mature thing at the time, and I let her go. And to my greatest surprise, she got married less than a year after we broke up. I couldn't have felt more stupid. How could I have not realized that she had already grown tired of me? Anyways, right after what happened between me and my childhood lovers, I closed myself off to any type of romantic relationships with women. I decided to focus on myself and on making something out of everything I had available at the time. I got a decent paying job that didn't demand much from me. I started working out and really got in shape. I took personal hygiene very seriously, among many other things. And before I knew what was happening, a number of years had gone by, and I was already clocking 32 years of age. Now, it wasn't like I knew what I wanted at the time, nor did I know whether I was ready to put myself out there, but the one thing I did know for sure was the fact that I had successfully completed most of the goals I had set for myself, and this on its own was more than enough for me. And so I took the next step towards putting myself out there, which was signing up on several dating websites. Although I needed some help in actually figuring out which ones would be best suited for me, I eventually got the hang of it, and all I needed to do was explore, as my colleagues nonchalantly put it. I had a hard time navigating the dating space, but one thing I knew for sure was the fact that I had a lot of attention on my profile. Basically, a lot of people found me attractive, and believe me when I say this, I had no idea what to do with all of this attention. I started off by replying to some of the compliments I had on my profile, and this got me talking with some beautiful and amazing ladies. Now, I don't know how, but I got talking with the woman who would turn out to be my future ex-wife. I want to keep her anonymous for my story's sake, so let's call my ex-wife Bernie. Bernie and I met in person about 3 weeks after a lot of back and forth conversations on the dating app, and she only agreed to meet up with me on the condition that we had our first meeting at her place. I had no idea what it was that she was planning, but one thing I did know for sure was that I didn't want to get involved with whatever it was that she had planned. I was just getting a different kind of energy whenever she brought up the topic of having the date over at her place. I soon gave in when I felt like I had no choice, as she was really attractive, I enjoyed our conversations, and I actually wanted to meet her in person. Anyways, fast forward to our very first meeting, and it wasn't at all what I was thinking. She actually wanted to make me something homemade, and I had the wrong impression of her from the very beginning. I felt really bad, and although I didn't tell her or say anything at all about how I was initially feeling, I decided that I was going to do something about it. and so what I did was, I made sure to put in extra effort, more than what was required, in order to make sure that she was impressed and more interested in whatever it was that we had going on. We got along pretty well. A whole lot of our interests aligned perfectly well, and we were both looking for the same thing in a partner at the time. So it was really easy for us to move to the next step, which was to basically get into a relationship. We were happily in a relationship for the better part of the next 2 years. She had to move to a different city at the time. She told me that she got a job offer that paid really well at the time. Although we thought that this was going to be a problem along the line, she assured me that she was fully committed to a relationship with me, and that I had nothing to worry about. Fast forward a few weeks after she moved, I was beginning to notice some slight changes in the way she acted. I just thought this was the distance, and that she was going to stay true to her words. I would soon find out, some years later, after we had gotten married that is, that she wasn't staying truthful, and in fact, she was being treated as an object for all of the men to pass around. During the time we spent apart, I had my reservations about her being alone, but after I resolved myself and moved to the city with her, my reservations were soon cleared. We spent the next year and a half together, living together, until I popped the question. I asked her if she would do me the honor of becoming my life partner, and although it was a tense moment, she said yes, which made me the happiest man. We got married a few months after my proposal. Our wedding preparations and proceedings went smoothly, and we had the help of both of our families. Funding the wedding wasn't an issue as well, as we both were able to pool in our resources, and also funding from both our parents helped out a lot. Of all the things I was able to accomplish, I was glad that giving my ex-wife her dream wedding was done successfully. Now, right after we had gotten married, I was expecting that the supposed honeymoon phase of marriages that I usually hear older couples talking about would come sooner rather than later. Unfortunately for me, I thought wrong. Just a few months after we had gotten married, Bernie had the same change of personality as she did when she moved away a few years back. But this time, it was even more obvious than before. She was beginning to stay out late on workdays. She was being secretive with her phone, which she had never done before. She had also developed a nonchalant attitude whenever I tried to do with her, what married couples normally do. She was always coming up with various excuses, and at first, I usually didn't think much of it. But one time, when I had the opportunity to have a peek at a message that popped up on her phone one day while she was preparing breakfast, my stance soon changed. I had lots of questions. I wanted to confront her as to what I had just seen on her phone, but I didn't want to be the problematic partner, always looking for trouble when there is none, and so I let it slide, but just for the meantime. This would soon change, as one very night when she got a call from her supposed work partner who kept on saying sweet things to her in the middle of the night. I was furious. When she got up the next morning, I asked her about what the call she got the previous night was about, and this was when she lashed out. She retaliated and we got into a serious argument, after which she stormed out of the house. She went to her sister's place, which wasn't too far from where we lived, and she stayed there for a whole week. After some time apart, she finally came back home, apologized, and asked that we move past that. I agreed because I missed her, and I didn't want to hold on to something I wasn't really sure of. Things went back to normal, until it wasn't anymore. It was not long after she had come back home that I got a message from my supervisor in the office. Apparently, I was being let go, along with a whole lot of my other coworkers. Basically, I was effectively relieved of my job. When I got back home that day, I told Bernie what had happened, and her reaction was not what I was expecting. She was only concerned with the issue of who was going to pay some certain bills in the house, and how we were going to survive moving forward. When I brought up the suggestion of her supporting me for a while until I could secure another job, this was when she showed her true colors. She said, and I quote, "If you know you're not man enough to provide for your family, then you're not man enough to have a family." I was confused as to why she would think this way, but it wasn't seeming like she was going to budge. And so, after being married for less than 2 years, she left the house immediately after our talk that night and came back 3 days later with divorce papers. She said she didn't want to be in a marriage with me anymore, as I lacked what was required of me as a provider. I was broken. Never in my wildest dreams could I have imagined that she could utter such words. What surprised me the most was how quickly she was pushing for the divorce and the splitting of everything I owned. Because she didn't bring anything to our home, I pleaded with her. as I told her that if she took everything I had, I would eventually become homeless before the month runs out. She couldn't have cared less. All she wanted was to take what I had and be on her way. I had no choice but to comply with the decision of the court, and eventually, just as I had predicted, I lost everything I owned and was left with less than $400. With nothing else to my name, I decided to wallow in my misery. As soon as I found out that she was getting engaged to another man, less than a few months after we had just gotten divorced, I went to the liquor store and purchased anything and everything I could get with all the money I had left. I still had some leftover change, and I caught a glimpse of a row of lottery tickets. I just decided to buy it, seeing as I had nothing to lose at this point. I drank till I passed out, and I woke up the next morning. When my mind was fully clear the next morning, I realized what I had just done. I had nothing to my name again. I had just spent every single penny I had left on me the night before, after my ex-wife took everything I had. While I was thinking of what to do, I found the lottery tickets I bought the night before. It just seemed like my last hope, and although I wasn't expecting much, I was still a bit hopeful. And to my greatest surprise, I had won a grand total of $600,000. I couldn't believe it at the time, so I went home first, washed up, and tried to get some sleep, hoping that when I woke up, things would return back to normal. Fortunately for me, this was my reality. The decision to pay for the lottery ticket finally bore fruit. I was overjoyed. The first thing I did was to tell my entire family, which was only my father and mother. I don't know which of them was keeping in contact with Bernie, but they told her, probably intentionally or unintentionally, and this brought Bernie back to my place with her lawyers in the hopes of getting her lawful share of my winnings. Unluckily for her, I was prepared for this. Apparently, she was expecting that I would claim the winnings in my name. Seeing as I was partially expecting her to come for me, I claimed the winnings in my father's name. This on its own actually allowed me to keep my winnings safe and away from the eyes of my vulture of an ex-wife. I could tell that she was unhappy with the way things turned out, but she had no say in the matter, and all she could do was just watch. I could see the regret in her eyes when she found out that she couldn't have her way. Not anymore. Our next story is, I paid my parents back after cheating me out of my grandparents' inheritance. I was cheated out of my family's entire fortune, left behind by my grandparents, and all of this was simply because of the fact that I was not a team player. Luckily for me, there was a saving grace that gave me back all that I was entitled to. I made sure to make every single one of my family pay for what they had planned for me. I, male, 26, was the sole heir to my grandparents' fortune. They, my now late grandparents, had managed quite a huge fortune during their time, and made sure that their entire generation to come would have no need for any form of financial assistance ever again. I was the only legitimate child of both my parents. This was until they both split up and my father had a second marriage. Now for context, I never wanted to take anyone's side at the time, even though I was forced to do so. I was only ultimately saved by my grandparents, who welcomed me with open arms into their home. It was at this point in my life that I'm now realizing that things had started to go wrong. Now, let me give you a little bit of a background on my family as a whole. Right before everything and everyone became totally different, my father, John, was the only son from my grandparents, and he got married to my biological mother, June, when they were still in college. My grandparents didn't approve of this union, as they believed at the time that she wasn't worthy enough for my father, as they also thought that she was just with him because she knew his parents were very much well off. Now, against all odds, they still went through with their marriage, and a year and a half down the line, they had me. It was around this time that my grandmother was diagnosed with a terminal heart condition. She was then confined to her home, with a whole army of caretakers, nurses, and doctors on standby. Seeing how dire the situation was, my biological mother decided to show her true colors. She filed for divorce, having high hopes that she was going to get half of whatever it was that my father was entitled to in the inheritance to come. It was a long and disturbing time. My mother was trying to get custody and half of what my father was going to be inheriting, while my father, on the other hand, seemed not to care at all about me, his son. His whole attention and focus was on whatever it was that he was trying to keep my mother away from. It was at this time that I moved in with my grandparents, as I could not bear to watch them. I lived with my grandparents all my teenage life, and it was soon brought to the attention of both my parents that the will that would state who inherited what in the family was being altered. This act put an indefinite halt to their whole squabble for quite some time. And in the long run, it was later revealed after my grandmother had passed that neither my father nor any of his siblings were going to be receiving a significant share of their inheritance. It came as a shock to quite literally everyone at the time, and even myself, that I received the highest and most significant share of my grandparents' fortune. This was where things got really heated in my family. There was a lot of commotion and retaliation. However, the only thing, or rather the only person, that truly had my back at the time was my grandfather's. As long as he was around and still alive, it was almost certain that nobody was going to be getting anything. This really put a dent in my relationship with both my father and my mother. Now, they still went ahead with their divorce, as I don't think they could stand themselves any longer. And I think this decision was for the best, as my father would no sooner meet his second wife, my stepmother, bring in her children into our lives, and complicate the whole issue all the more. My mother, on the other hand, decided not to remarry, as I don't think she ever trusted any man after my father. Now, on to my stepmother and her children. She met my father about 2 years after the divorce with my mother, and they got married less than a year after they had met. Now everyone in my family knew fully well what her intentions were, and nobody was willing to let up. However, little did we know that she had an even more devious plan in mind. She went as far as going after my grandfather. We can't say for sure what she did. However, one thing is certain, is that upon her arrival to my grandparents' home, my grandfather mysteriously came down with an illness that left him bedridden until he ultimately passed away some few months later. There was a whole other round of commotion at this time, as we were all trying to figure out the next step to take. Now, take note, at this time I was just 20. I didn't have much going on for me at the time. I had just finished high school and I wasn't planning on going to college. There was absolutely no need for me to do so. However, my father kept on pushing me to do so, as he claimed that once I was in, I should also do the right thing and sponsor my step-siblings too. What angered me the most at this time was not the fact that he said what he said. It was simply the fact that his own father was on his deathbed, and instead of actually being with him in his final moments, my father, alongside every other member of my family that was hoping to have a share of my grandparents' inheritance, were simply strategizing and making plans on how to properly spend their own share of the inheritance. It was maddening and also sickening. I couldn't believe my own parents were of such nature. I tried as much as possible to ensure that none of them got a single share of what my grandparents had left, but little did I know that there was a whole lot of in-play behind the scenes, and I was the only one not kept in the loop. Now, fast forward a bit after my grandfather passed away. The entire family mourned just for a single day, and then the very next day, everyone was already contacting their lawyers, trying to get themselves ready for what's to come. At this time, my stepmother was plotting something else with my father. So apparently, she had her own role to play in altering my grandfather's will, and the result of this was taking basically everything my grandfather left behind in my name and simply replacing it with my father's name, which would then make her all the more likely to get a significantly higher share than what she was going to get before, following her plan to divorce my father and take half of everything he owned afterwards. We found out her plans afterwards, but what happened before that was that I basically got robbed of everything. My mother wasn't too angry at the fact that she, my stepmother, did what she had been planning for quite some time, as she would be entitled to a significant share of the inheritance. I was left with basically nothing. A few months following my grandfather's passing, my parents had already sold the mansion my grandparents lived in, and basically all of the liquefiable assets that were left behind, and they all went their merry way. At this time, I was 25, and seeing as I didn't go to college, I had nothing to fall back to when applying for jobs. I had to fend for myself, as both my parents made it clear to me, as at the time they were leaving, that all of what was happening to me was a result of the fact that I tried to hoard everything my grandparents left behind for myself. They offered to give me a share of what I was entitled to, but I simply turned them down. I had a long way to go before I was able to get myself back on my feet, and my life back on track. I had no idea what to do. Neither did I have any clue where to begin, but the one thing I knew for sure was that no matter what, I wasn't going to give up until I had made sure that every single member of my family paid for what they did to me. For survival at the time, I got a job at a local restaurant in town, and I pleaded with the manager to let me spend the coming nights in the break room. This was until I was able to get a place for myself, and thankfully, out of the mercy of his heart, he accepted, no questions asked. I stayed there for the better part of the next 6 months. This was until I was contacted by my grandfather's lawyer, who I had met countless times over the years while I was staying over at their mansion. He walked in one day during my shift and immediately recognized me. We exchanged pleasantries, and he immediately asked what I was doing in that establishment. I gave him a quick recap as to what happened since the last time I saw him, and he was shocked, but mostly surprised that I never thought to reach out to him, as he knew I always thought of him as my grandfather's brother. He simply told me that there were a lot of things I could have done at that time, and not simply accept what was given to me. He went further by saying that my grandfather actually set aside a trust fund solely for me. I was confused and also alarmed. According to him, the conditions of the trust was that I was only to receive it when and only when I didn't get anything from the inheritance he left behind. The whole case was confusing me at the time, but my grandfather's lawyer was willing to help me get back everything that was mine. I was so happy that our paths crossed that day, as this would mark the day everything changed for me yet again. We got started on the documentation, a whole lot of it. It took countless hours of reading and proofreading, but he was eventually ready to help me get back what was mine, and so was I. Following a certain clause in the will left behind by my grandfather, where he stated that in the case where the one who receives all of his trust assets doesn't get anything from his inheritance, all of his inheritance was to be seized and immediately returned to its rightful owners, or immediately donated to a charity foundation. It didn't take long after we had solidified our stand before we were able to recover basically all of the stolen assets and properties. It was at this time that my parents realized that I was the one with the entirety of my grandparents' trust. This was when they came back crawling and begging, as they knew that everything was now in the palm of my hands. When I looked them straight in their eyes, I saw no single shred of love for me in their eyes, only greed. The only reason they came back was simply to get something out of the entire situation, and so I decided to crush all of their dreams and hopes by donating every single recovered asset to a charity foundation. What they didn't know was that I purchased said foundation, and in the process recovered every single asset that was mine from the very beginning. With no source of income or funds to sponsor their lavish lifestyles, my parents had to stay on the streets just to survive. I haven't seen them since I got back what they stole, but I'm pretty sure they're doing just okay for themselves, I think. With that being said, that's all the time we have for today. If you enjoyed today's video, drop a like and comment below, and if you want to check out our other videos, click the video on the right. With that being said, I'll see you all next time.